So I want to introduce to you the second keynote speaker, and his name is Keith Tam. Tam Chiheng, Tam Chiheng Losi. Losi. Keith was born in Hong Kong, native Hong Konger. Went to England, to the UK with his parents when aged. By myself, actually. Not with your parents. Oh, that was a misunderstanding. I'm sorry for that. But Keith studied in England at the University of Reading, the world-famous type design class in the University of Reading, and degreed there. Then later on moved to Canada, Vancouver, where he worked as a professor or associate professor for visual communication at the Emily Carr Institute there for many years, and then in 2006 returned to Hong Kong to be an associate professor and head of Department of Visual Communication at the Polytechnic University of Hong Kong. And I've met Keith. I mean, we didn't meet. We just had contact via email. It started in 2002, I think, when I was working on my degree project in Germany. It was about Chinese and Latin typography. And so I asked somebody who told me, you have to ask Keith Tam about Chinese fonts. And so I asked him a humble question about which fonts should I use, and he answered me. And since then we were into contact, and in 2006 we met for the first time. And Keith recently established an information design lab at this school, where they're doing large projects right now, or even just starting up, but I suppose them to be larger in the future, and where he's really concerned about multilingual typography issues, and he wants to establish this topic closely to that school too, and closely to the teaching in that school, and we are very happy about that, and it's a wonderful exchange that we have, and I want to thank you for that as well on this point. So I'll leave up the word for you.
No, I think I can use the remote. Too many things to carry, I think, but it's okay. Welcome to PolyU, and it's great to see you here. This is a rare opportunity because this topic is so new internationally, but also locally. So I'm glad you guys are here, so we can have some exchange and sharing about this topic. So my name is Keith Tam, as Roman just said. I'm going to kind of lend a little bit of a Hong Kong perspective to the whole idea of bilingual or multilingual typography. Because even if you use two languages, the same languages, if you use it in a different country, different place, it's not necessarily the same because the culture is completely different. I'm going to start with a little, I don't know if you've had breakfast yet, you've just had a little bit of a food to eat outside. And this is a very typical Hong Kong breakfast. I don't know if you know. Is it really Chinese? Is it English? What is it? You know, when you say, okay, let's go for breakfast, you know, we have something like this, and nobody would think twice whether it's Chinese or English or whatever. It's uniquely Hong Kong, isn't it? What's Chinese about it? Nothing. If you look at the noodles, yeah, well, it depends how you see it, right? Well, yeah, originally, you can say. All the elements are not Chinese, expressly Chinese, but the rules of combinations, if you think about it, is very Chinese in a way. Or it's a mix of cultures. You know, this bowl of noodles, where did it come from? I don't know. I mean, it's probably the idea that you would eat fried egg and toast with cereal in an English breakfast. I don't know whether that has any connection with it, although this is hot and the other one is cold. And we have noodles. You know, I think bilingual typography is something like this. I think for a lot of purists, you know, bilingual typography is kind of something that's, you know, a little bit confused. But for me, I think this is what makes Hong Kong unique, is how we use our language, the two languages. And it's reflected in the food. It's the same idea. So I'm going to challenge you with a little bit of with a little proposition today in my presentation. Is bilingual typography all about visual harmony. I beg to differ. But I think you see it in the presentation. So, is this visual harmony? It's a bit dark. You know, using a brush script with a Kai-Su calligraphy, is that what visual harmony is about? It's a little bit Chinatown-ish. When you see it, you know right away this is Chinese culture. This is from Hollywood Road. You know that street with all the antique shops? It's this visual harmony. It's a seal script, Sun Su, right? With this, what is this typeface called? Trolling Chan. Chop suey or something, I don't know. Something like that, or chopsticks, something like that. Stuff you see at Chinese restaurants all around the world, right? Again, instantly recognizable as Chinese, symbolic for Chinese culture. And then how about this, a modernist approach? Minimal, condensed, kind of a sans serif font with really geometric Chinese shapes that mimics the English, the modernist approach. Is this visual harmony? It's probably just by chance that the forms are so simple in the Chinese characters. What if you have a more complicated character? What would you do? Well, how about this? You have a whole range of approaches here. Yeah? Flamboyant, kind of Chinese and English, the Chinese encroaching the English, right? How about this? Is that visual harmony? How about this one? Using the same tool, and using the same brush to write both languages. Is that visual harmony? Yes, I think so. But is this the only way? How can two languages be the same? We're not talking about languages that both use the Latin alphabet. We're talking about an ideographic language, Chinese, which is more visual and less phonetic, and an alphabetic language. And when you look at that, they occupy the same square, don't they? Okay. How about this? Now we're introducing a different element to it, which has almost the same semantic value, but not quite, in one of the languages. How about this? Now it's proportional spaced. Is that the same thing anymore? It doesn't even occupy the same space. And how about that? Is this a word? Are these words? Or are these words? Or are they letters? How do we define that? What is the smallest semantic unit of both languages? Are they the same? How about that? And that, for that matter. So many differences. You notice the Chinese didn't change at all. On the left, the character remained the same. So when we look at both languages from a linguistic point of view, from a visual point of view, they are completely different. Completely different. How do we reconcile the two languages in our designs? And anatomically is very different. The way you measure it is completely different. There's no way to make them comparable in a way. So why bother? So I'm going to show you some examples from Hong Kong. You might have seen these examples if you're from Hong Kong. I think a lot of you are from Hong Kong, you're from this area. You've seen these many times probably, but I want to kind of give it all a kind of perspective to it. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you look at these in a new perspective. Okay, so pre-1970s, I'm going to talk about the 70s a little bit later. The early days of colonial Hong Kong, were there any bilingualism in Hong Kong? The use of English was very much restricted to the ruling class, you can say, right? The governmental education, elitist education usually, you probably know that. Also, legal domains, English was used. The two languages from a linguistics point of view is called diglossia, where they are separate. And used by the dominant ruling class in the early colonial days. So in terms of typography, it's reflected in the signage you can see from those days. This is from the typo market, the old typo market station. It's now in the Railway Museum. It's really interesting. It's great that they've preserved this bit of Hong Kong history, visual culture. When you look at the two languages, they are not trying to be the same at all. When you look at the style, it's different because the method of production is different. Right? The English, because it's alphabetic, all the stations share probably the same character set. It's not really anything unique to every station. So a person who's untrained in English can actually produce something like this. Right? And the Chinese, of course, was handwritten with a brush by a calligrapher. Right? No attempt to put the two together in a way, visually, except maybe the border and the common background. Right? So this is another example. They've repeated the name of the station this time. Same idea. Well, this time you can see the two syllables are not separated. Like this one, Tai and Po are separate, right? And this one is together. I have a speculation that this might be from a slightly earlier era, because at one point the Hong Kong government actually standardized all transliterations of place names in Hong Kong to separate them in syllables. Another really elegant pre-70s example. This one is from 1928. This is still there. It is at the Botanical Garden in Central. Such an elegant and dignified way of treating two cultures. Very, very sensitive. And this is a memorial for 2 world wars in Hong Kong, using an archway that's quite Chinese in a way. Couplets. They're not actually couplets. 對聯啊，其實唔係對聯嚟嘅呢個 okay? Because they are exactly the same, right? But using that convention or that genre in Chinese literature to present the 2 world wars separated on 2 sides, with the dates on either side, right? It's outside, inside, and then the headstone at the top. It's a very traditional way of doing monuments in Europe, right? Centered, perfectly symmetrical, in a very dignified Roman caps, right? So the message is not separated there. I think this is one of the most beautiful examples. Again, still pre-70s. I hope they don't get rid of this because they're moving the whole government offices to, I think we can see it from here actually. Oh no, it's just blocking. In Admiralty. And I hope they preserve this because this is not just a message, this is history. This is very sophisticated sensitivity to culture, I think. It wouldn't offend either culture at all. Here, by sequence, you still read the Chinese first, right? In a 大書, 隶書, very official looking, very formal kind of script. And then you have the central message, central government offices, East Wing, that's the most important message by volume, by area and by the visual presence, which bypasses the sequencing of the 2 languages. Because although this one is visually more engaging, the order is second to the Chinese. Yes?
When did they change the direction of the Chinese from right to left?
I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure.
It was the ones
Yeah.
before.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. I'm not so sure about that. This one is, yeah, that's right, yeah. In newspapers, I think it was not until the 90s when they changed the headlines from right to left to left to right. But in this case, I'm not sure. Yeah. That's right, yeah. It's actually interchangeable, the 2 ways. Yeah. So I think this is a very subtle but very well-considered piece of bilingual typography. For a more local example, less about official governmental message. This is very, very local, public housing in Seoul Chun, right, in Sam Shui Po, Hong Kong. This is from the 60s, around the 60s, when the government started to build public housing for the public, for people, like cheaper housing. Gill sands, again, very prevalent at that time in the UK. We import these typographic conventions. Again, the Chinese in a kaishu, right? Handwritten with a brush again. Very subtle. The English is first in the sequence, and then the Chinese. You cannot say visually they carry the same weight, because when you measure the capital height, when you compare them, they are more or less the same, but Chinese always looks a bit smaller because of the internal white space and how you construct the characters. An interesting thing about this example is how the S is upside down. I mean, for me, what you can tell from that little subtle detail is the sign, this lettering must have been made by a Chinese person who didn't know so much about, Western typography. Yeah, in Europe as well. Yeah, okay. That's not just Hong Kong. I agree with you. Yeah, just subtle sign. Okay. So what happened in the 60s? Okay, there's another example actually. But actually, I'm going to talk about this later. What happened in the 60s? Riots in Hong Kong, right? There was a huge anti-colonial government kind of sentiment building up in China, in Hong Kong, partly because of what's happening in China at that time as well, the Cultural Revolution and all. People started to feel that we need to play a part in the society. We need to have a say. We need to have a voice in the society. So the two riots in the 60s kind of fueled what we call 中文运动, right? Chinese movement early in the 70s, right? Because of the diglossia I was talking about, where when you want to make a complaint to the government, you need to write in English, but not everybody can do that, given the education at that time. And there was just basically no channel to express yourself, your opinions to the government. So this riot fueled the Chinese movement. And in 1974, the government passed the Official Languages Ordinance. What better way to look at what they really mean in terms of typography by going to the laws of Hong Kong, spread from that. Yeah, this is the best they can do, I think. Okay, they're not designers. So this is where two languages in parallel, this is the epitome of that because it's a legal document. So after the 70s, after 1974, Chinese became a co-official language. So with that, came with also the 9 years of free public education, education for students in Hong Kong, for school-age children, up to Form 3, is it? Up to Form 3, from primary school to Form 3. So the idea that the use of English has changed because of this, and the use of Chinese as well. So with that Chinese movement, we also see, in the 60s and 70s, kind of the colonial government was trying to give the public more public facilities and a whole range of public services. And we start to see parks like these. Kowloon Sai Park. It's not far from here. There's some really interesting lettering in this park, at the entrance of this park. This is the oldest probably because it's cast onto a stone wall. Okay. How are the two languages interacting with each other? We see the English first again, and the Chinese again in Li Shu, right? What's happening here? Nothing like that in the English. The N is not smaller. Why is that? That's a Chinese custom or convention to de-emphasize words that are a little bit minor, or connectors, right? So that doesn't really mean and, it means in addition to or something like that. The meaning is a little bit different. And look at the English lettering. Definitely not done by a professional, right? Definitely done by an amateur. Look at this S is, okay, for you type designers out there, this S is not very well formed, right? So again, you can see, done by a Chinese person probably, but the two different production methods are different as well. So another example from there, just above this sign, there's a swimming pool sign. Okay, looks like a temporary sign, I'm not sure, but it's still there. Again, stencils, because everybody can do it, even if you don't have no knowledge of the culture. Stencil lettering for the English and Chinese, hand-drawn. Not stencil, it's actually directly painted onto it. So how are the two languages interacting with each other? They are not. They are really not doing anything at all. They're just sitting there by themselves. Another one. Right? So you can see the changes are starting to happen. Judging from the fact that is managed by the Leisure and Cultural Services Department, I can safely say this is post-1997, I think. Look what's happening with the typography. Okay, production method has a lot to do with this. Okay, production method is digitally produced, silk screened, with 2 colors, 3 colors. This Helvetica phenomenon is coming in. You can see that. Caps, well, that's the most telling thing, where the designer think, okay, because at least, if we use uppercase letters, at least is more kind of, you can say it's the equivalent of the Chinese. Nothing so exciting about this, but you can see a difference in terms of mentality or approach in designing. This is another example. The S is upside down again. But this is an example where there's no sensibility at all, because why does it have to be stretched out so big? There's no reason for that, but there's a sentiment that, okay, this Helvetica-ish Chinese, Haiti, Hattai, is not really doing anything for us anymore, so we need to go back and look back into the history and, okay, Kai Su is better, even though this is digital, it's a little bit better. There's no reason why this has to be this size. There's no reason why the two languages have to have this spacing at all. This is probably post-2000, I think. You can see the difference in approach. Which one? This one? No, the other one. Okay. All right. Okay. And, for a more contemporary example, or a more everyday example, we see Sammy, who's giving a presentation tomorrow. He was, it's gone. He had played a major part in developing this typeface for the MTR in the early days. It's still in use, although it's going to be is gradually being replaced by your other typeface. Still works pretty much the same way. I think Henry participated in the early days as well. Yeah. I think this is a really great example of how the two don't have to harmonize at all, but respecting each other's conventions and properties. I think this is a very classic example that works quite well, I think, because the two languages are distinct. There's no mistake about that. So my proposition, bilingual typography is not just all about visual harmony, although partly it is. It's about how various constituent parts of the language interact with each other under different contexts and for different purposes. This is, I think, a very interesting example about status relationship of the two languages. So in this case, this is from my high school days, I think. Two different production methods are not just production methods. They're not just technical. At that time, it would have been printed by Yao Yan. I don't know how to say that. Yao Yan, kind of like this wax paper, and you kind of, I don't know, duplicating machine. Mimeography, yeah, that's right, yeah. Of course, they wouldn't have had a Chinese typewriter. They had to use two different ways of producing this. But it's not just the visual effect. I think this is, when we look at this is kind of nostalgic for us. But it's not just about that, because of the difference in production method. One is handwritten, one is typewritten. The status relationship between the two is very different. Right? And my testimonial, okay, one exercise I tried in my research is to try eliminating the languages one by one and see what happens. See, I've eliminated all the Chinese. It still reads like a continuous prose, right? How about if I eliminate the English? You don't see much. You're missing a lot of information there. And then if we just look at the dynamic information, which is the information not pre-printed, we get this. So this is, for me, an interesting way of analyzing the examples and kind of trying to draw some insights from them. So the way I look at typography as a designer, as a researcher, is looking at typography as kind of like a crossroads of typography in the middle is in the middle of language and technology. Language, I think, and technology are related because it has to do with the way we generate our text and process our information. Everything about character sets and glyphs and encoding and things like that has to do with how we communicate with text. And then culture and aesthetics kind of are related as well. So I think typography is in the middle of that. In my research, I've been using linguistics a lot because I want to try to understand on a linguistic level how it relates to the visual level and how it relates to culture and society and maybe politics. So a very common framework for looking at any visual form, semiotic analysis. I don't just want to focus on the syntactics part. I want to look at how they relate with language and also with how we use things, how we access information, because I lend an information design perspective to my work. So how the user searches and access information, looking for things. What can we do as designers to help that? So it's not just verbal language, it's not just visual language, it's both, operating on two levels, right? So it's a verbal graphic hybrid language, I'm saying. So the multilingual typography, when you introduce another language, there is another verbal and visual level that cross-pollinate with each other, becomes a complex network. And then what results is a third language and a third culture. So when we look at bilingual typography, we look at these three different aspects. Parallel. Two languages are presented as equivalents. And code mixing, one language is embedded into another below the clause level. So you don't say a complete sentence in the middle of your sentence in another language. You intersperse words in another language in there. There are a lot of different motivations for doing that from a linguistics point of view. And then code switching, where you actually switch to another language at the sentence or higher level. So there are different intentions and purposes for that. So an analytical framework, sorry to bombard you with all these diagrams and ways of looking at things. So two levels, verbal graphic language and verbal language. We'll talk about status relationship between the two, just from purely content point of view, before the content has form, okay? Semantic structure of the content, because the content has different parts to it, and they follow a particular logic. And then how we, as designers, transform that visually in terms of a global visual hierarchy that speaks to the status relationship, and how it interacts with the local visual hierarchy in the individual languages. Okay, I think you've probably had enough of this. So these things are translated with graphical and spatial attributes as designers. Just want to say a few words about Swiss typography. So this is a very classic book by Emil Ruder, a classic text on modernist, Swiss modern typography. It's presented in 3 languages, right? Very considered use of grid, very logical disposition of information. You can see the columns are assigned a particular language. So technically, if you follow this logic, you will find what you're looking for, right? Is it really? Well, things span across 3 columns. You cannot work in a simple way like this, right? Here is in sequence. But the problem with this is different from Chinese and English because all 3 languages use the Latin alphabet. And it's not immediately apparent what language you're looking at. If you have Chinese, it's easier. So different problem. So I would say, the Swiss grid is part of the solution, but it's not the whole solution. Look at an analysis of just a single page of an independent film festival program. Green is Chinese, blue is English. The pink is the shared information between the 2 languages. And you can see the grouping of the information based on category, maybe, and subgroupings. Right? You can see the complexity of something like this in terms of semantic structure and also visual structure. I think this is a very good example of organizing everything without losing the how we access the information. So when we talk about same and difference, when I was thinking about the title for this symposium, Roman and I came up with this together. What do we mean by that? Same in terms of status, or different, category of information, grouping, semantic level, language, sequence. These are the things that we have to consider. So I have an analogy. Cityscapes, right? Hierarchy. There are only 2 things we do as designers. Make things important, more important than everything else. Make things different from everything else. Or sometimes make things the same and different from everything else, right? Becomes a focal point. If you have something like this, then where do we start, where do we end? We don't know. So if you're familiar with eye tracking research, as designers, as human beings, we look for patterns, we look for grouping, we look for meaning, basically, right? Relationships between things. If you imagine, our eyes move around all the time, we fixate on things very, very briefly. Look at the 2/10, 8/10 of a second. Movements between fixations are even faster. So we look for things that catches our attention. So when we consider bilingual typography, we have to think about how we focus the attention for the users in terms of design. Difference in run length is already a problem because the visual presence is different of the 2 languages by nature. Do we do this? And how do we search for the beginning of the other language? How about here when they are more or less the same run length, but still taking up different presence on the visual field? And how about in a list and matrix configuration? How do we search for information then, like this? Right? This is a matrix configuration. You can cross-reference. And this is a more linear way of searching. And then we have to talk about reading directions, of course. In a typical corner shop in Hong Kong, you would, because Chinese can be read on either way, you see the sign on the corner, they start from the middle and radiate out 2 corners. And then when you have stupid things like this, where the designer had no understanding of how the language works, right? It took me a while to figure this out. And I was lucky because I just got off my bus and then it was right there, stopping at a red light. So I took my phone out and took this picture. It's a really great example. So I'm not going to bore you with this. This is actually breaking down everything, all the graphical and spatial things that we can do to typography to kind of organize bilingual information. So basically, there are 5 main categories, two major categories, graphic and spatial, 5 main categories, and 76 comparisons, looking at breaking everything down to very small. So the yellow parts, they're the common things that can be shared completely between the 2 languages. The grayed out parts, there are no equivalents at all. Not just looking at the visual, but also the semantic level. And the compartmentalized parts, there are kind of visual equivalents, but not absolute equivalents. So I'm going to go through this quickly because I notice I only have 6 minutes left. Very good example of parallel setting. To me, this is a really good use of grid to aid wayfinding in the publication because it's very predictable, easy to find things. But there's a clear status relationship. English is clearly more dominant by sequence and also by visual presence. I'm not going to go into that too much. So the way of using visual devices to structure the information is very good. Okay, here is a slightly different approach where there is some randomness in terms of application of typographic devices to construct the hierarchy, because some are kind of emphasized but not really part of the same semantic structure. So my other question is multi-script multilingual? I think I already established that so far in the presentation. Multi-script is not multilingual. You use Chinese doesn't mean it's Chinese. It can actually mean it's English or something else. When you use English, it could actually be Chinese. Hard to imagine that, right? But okay, this is a really good example. This is a very recent example Brian shared with me on Facebook. The university games is on right now in Shenzhen, and look at the signs they have for that. 会展中心地铁站. Is that English? That's not English at all. It's Chinese, even though it's using the Roman alphabet. So it does a lot of damage to communication that way. And this is so fresh. We just saw that in the taxi this morning. I had to add this in. It was right next to our taxi. What's Fruitland? What is that? Okay, I'm not a linguist. Okay, I'm sure if you look into the history of this word, I don't know, it might be in our dictionary sometime soon. I don't know, I'm not sure. So in a typical sign like this in Hong Kong, where the names of the businesses are transliterated, there is a structure to this as well. Syllable by syllable transliteration is a way of handling bilingual typography. And the other one, where the English words restaurant is spanned across the 2 characters, provides a visual grouping for the information. And then there's Milk Magazine, a magazine for young people, all about consumerism, if I may be so critical. Brand names, you have to use English. Nobody's going to accept a transliteration of a brand name. I don't know. I don't have any examples to tell you about, but it seems that in China this is fine, but in Hong Kong it does not work at all because it's so uncool. So code switching, code mixing, this is code switching. All the elements that attract your attention as focal points on the page are not English, not Chinese, but they function. They don't function as English at all, linguistically, because all the body text is Chinese. Right? And there's something like this. I think I'm sure linguists still have no idea what this phenomenon is all about. They are is in English. Usually it's the other way around when you talk about code mixing and code switching. Muse magazine is another really good example. A lot of people are returning from overseas or they've lived somewhere else and they're not sure quite sure whether they're Chinese or something else, this would be a perfect publication for them. Not direct translation, no parallelism. It's all about code switching and code mixing. So you see an article with the headlines in English, the whole text is in Chinese, and then with a pull quote in English. So take your pick, doesn't matter. I think this is a great example. I love it. You know, things like that, right? English mostly with a little bit of code mixing. One thing that they make sure is all the names who are Chinese people, they would use Chinese first and then put in brackets the English. This is a very new magazine as well, Taobao magazine. Again, a consumerism magazine. Same things happening. Look at the diagram. It's mostly blue. But is it really English? No, it's Chinese. It's a third language. I don't know what it is. Hong Kongese, probably. Okay. Okay. Yeah, this is a newsletter from a supermarket. Again, you know, all the visual hooks that attract your attention are not in Chinese. And code mixing can also work in another way, where, you know, just by the use of the colors, actually non-Chinese people can understand this as well. Although Chinese is written as a continuous sentence, kind of. So code mixing can function on that level as well. If you're wondering where you can have that breakfast, it's this place on Parker Street in Jordan. They serve really good fried eggs and milk and toast. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Keith. Thank you very much. We have still some few minutes left before lunch, right?
Yeah, we have 15 minutes. Oh, no, 10 minutes.
So I'm interested in a very obvious thing, like how is the impact of all those places you have lived on your thinking on typography? You have lived in Canada, England,
okay.
China.
Oh, okay. I don't know where to start because it's a complex question.
Yes,
okay, I partly grew up in Hong Kong, of course. So all of this stuff that I've shown, you know, they have personal stories for me. Like they are very much part of my culture. But on the other hand, I was educated in Canada and UK for a large part of my life. And especially in terms of design education, I did not study design in Hong Kong, although I pay a lot of attention to what's happening. So I still carry this Western perspective, sadly, Occidental logic. You can see that in the whole research that I've presented. So I don't know. I mean, in many ways that I cannot describe, but I'm trying to reacquaint with my own culture as well for the past 5 years, and looking at it closely, scrutinizing it. So it's all good, I guess.
So how do you see the role of multilingual typography approaches in information design?
Okay, that's a very good question. Because I see typography as information design. I don't see a difference at all. In fact, I would rather call it information design than typography. Although that seems extreme. It's very extreme, but that's my point of view. Because the word typography carries a lot of baggage, right? Printing, right? Or now we don't use the word typography just for printed type. We use the word for, you know, this is not typography. You know, this is not typography. It's not. It's lettering. It's hand lettering, or it's calligraphy, but it's not typography. So I think because of the confusion, I see, you know, I would prefer to use the word information design and encompass everything I just showed. So it's important. Yeah.
So what do you think about the visuality of cultural difference, the visual aspects of cultural differences? Are cultural differences visual, or can they be?
Very large part of it is, because we rely on our vision in our everyday life, I guess. Well, some of us who are lucky, okay. It is a culture in itself, and I don't see it as, although, there are symbolisms in cultures that have to be, you have to have the cultural background to understand it. But I see everything as a manifestation of culture. And it's not about symbolic elements. Like, the hotel sign, the chop suey font, I think this is really interesting. Is in many ways. So I don't know if that answers your question.
So anybody, some questions left? Okay.
Keith, thank you very much for the presentation. I think one of the important things I think from your presentation I found out is the understanding of treating multilingual typography. We have to use the way of unequalness to look at that, because just like what you said about the book about Emil Rudder, the book is very logical, and we have all three languages lined up together. But in an actual design situations, many times we cannot allow to do that. And this is the important thing that you find out. And I think as a designer, and now information can be retrieved everywhere, in the web or everywhere. So it's not necessary to show the information in a parallel way. Uh-huh. I personally believe that, because I personally come from Macau, and in Macau, every publication has three languages, Chinese, English, and Portuguese. And the designer in Macau are learning the way to how to treat three languages together. One way to do this is, the most population people are Chinese, so the Chinese getting very prominent, and then the English very subtle, and then the Portuguese right now is received to the background, and that's how we treat it. And now, if you say, "Well, this is not fair," but if you put everything together,
it's not about fairness.
It's not working. So I think your observation here is actually give us a very good insight as to accept. If you want to treat it multilingual, we have to be unequal.
But I believe fairness is also one of the purposes, or sometimes one of the intentions.
So I think that presentation is very useful, and it's very important for me for us to look into it.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Thanks.
So time is running out a little bit. Is there some, Rudi?
About the different languages, because it's presenting a way of power at all, of influence and power. But I will come back to one little detail, but I think not so sad one, is the point of phonetic. When we look at something like this, you can say, okay, we don't have a connection in between the English and the Chinese. The one don't understand the other. There are two sign categories, and you have two hierarchy. As graphic designer, from time to time, you give a connection in between a form and the content. So that's normal. But you give also from time to time in Occident, I don't know in China, a connection in between something you are and a form. Yeah. And what's the traduction of this? You give one example who you had this phonetical traduction on it. Will be interesting to connect probably this and the content. Charlie.
Which one?
Yes, that's a good example. Huh? So
I have some other examples
is
of that.
phonetic,
Yeah.
and the restaurant is meaning.
Yeah, I think there's something there as well. I agree with you. Well, Chinese is an expressly visual language to start with, although it is also phonetic because we have 6 ways of creating Chinese characters. But it's not all of it, it's part of it. So I think it makes the Chinese language quite rich in a way because of that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential to explore that as designers, I think so, yeah.
So Keith, thank you very much